The bitter wind howled across the empty Dakota plains as Wyatt Callahan spotted something unusual on the horizon, a lone figure huddled against the setting sun, seemingly more shadow than substance. It was October 1876, and winter was already making its early arrival known in the unforgiving territory. Wyatt tugged his hat lower against the wind and urged his chestnut mare forward. As the rancher drew closer, his breath caught in his throat. There, sitting on a worn trunk with nothing but a faded quilt wrapped around her shoulders and a bundle clutched tightly to her chest, was a young woman with eyes as hollow as the abandoned homestead behind her. "Madam," he called out, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "You all right out here?" The woman looked up, revealing a face that might have been beautiful once, before grief and hardship had carved their permanent marks. Her dark hair whipped wildly around pale features. "We're fine," she responded, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. The bundle in her arms moved slightly, and Wyatt realized with a start that it was a baby. He dismounted, approaching slowly so as not to frighten her. "Name's Wyatt Callahan. I own the Circle C Ranch about 5 miles west. This is no night for anyone to be out, especially not with a little one." She clutched the baby tighter. "I'm Victoria Webb. Mrs. Victoria Webb." Her chin lifted slightly at the declaration. "My husband." Her voice faltered. "I understand," Wyatt said softly, noticing the fresh turned earth several yards away, a grave marker fashioned from 2 sticks bound together. The story was all too common in these parts. Illness, accident, or violence claiming lives and leaving families adrift. The baby whimpered, and Victoria adjusted the quilt to better shield the infant from the wind. "How old?" Wyatt asked, nodding toward the child. "For months. Her name is Emma." A ghost of a smile touched Victoria's lips as she glanced down at her daughter. Wyatt looked at the darkening sky, then at the dilapidated cabin behind them. "That place isn't fit for shelter tonight. Storm's coming in hard." "It's all we have," Victoria said. "My husband James bought this claim. We were going to build something better, but then the fever took him 3 days ago." The wind picked up, carrying the first biting pellets of sleet. The baby began to cry in earnest. "Mrs. Webb, I'm offering you a warm place for the night. My ranch house isn't fancy, but it's solid. You can think about tomorrow when it comes." He gestured toward his horse. "My Penny here is steady. She'll carry us all back before the worst hits." Victoria hesitated, her eyes searching his face for any sign of deception or threat. Wyatt stood patiently, letting her look her fill. He knew what he was 32 years old, weathered by sun and work, with more calluses than charm. But his mother had raised him right before consumption had taken her too young, and he'd never abandoned someone in need. "Why would you help strangers?" Victoria finally asked. "Out here, nobody survives alone," Wyatt replied simply. "Your husband would have done the same for me or mine." A particularly vicious gust nearly knocked Victoria off her perch. The decision was made for her as sleep began to fall in earnest. "My trunk, it's all I have left," she said, standing unsteadily. "I'll come back for it tomorrow," Wyatt promised. "Right now, we need to get you and little Emma to safety." Carefully, he helped Victoria and the baby onto Penny, then mounted behind them. Victoria sat stiffly at first, uncomfortable with the proximity to a stranger, but as they rode through the worsening storm, she gradually leaned back against his chest, seeking warmth for her child's sake. The journey to Circle C Ranch seemed endless through the blinding sleet, but Penny knew her way home. Finally, the dark shape of Wyatt's ranch house emerged through the white veil of precipitation. It wasn't large, but it was solidly built of timber with a welcoming porch and chimney billowing smoke. "Mrs. Peterson," Wyatt called as he helped Victoria dismount at the porch. The front door swung open, revealing a stout older woman with gray hair tucked under a cap. "Lord above, Wyatt Callahan. What have you?" The woman stopped short at the sight of Victoria and the baby. Her expression immediately softened. "Bring them in this instant. The poor dears are half frozen." Mrs. Peterson, Wyatt's housekeeper and cook since he'd established the ranch for years prior, took charge with the efficiency of a cavalry commander. Within minutes, Victoria was seated before the roaring fireplace with the baby unwrapped and checked for any ill effects from the cold. "She seems fine," Mrs. Peterson declared, handing Emma back to her mother. "Healthy lungs on that one." Victoria's shoulders sagged in relief as she cradled her daughter. Wyatt disappeared to the kitchen and returned with a cup of hot coffee liberally laced with honey. "Drink," he instructed gently. "It'll warm you from the inside." As Victoria sipped the steaming liquid, Wyatt explained the situation to Mrs. Peterson in low tones. The older woman's face grew somber, and she nodded in understanding. "The blue room is ready," she told Wyatt. "I'll find something for the baby to sleep in." "Thank you," Victoria said, her voice stronger now. "I don't know how to repay your kindness, but I promise we won't be a burden. As soon as the storm passes, we'll be on our way." Wyatt and Mrs. Peterson exchanged glances. "There's no hurry," Wyatt said. "Winter's setting in early this year. You need time to figure things out." Victoria's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "I don't even know where to go. James sold everything we had to buy that homestead. We came west for a new beginning, and now—" She trailed off, looking down at Emma. "First things first," Mrs. Peterson said practically. "A hot meal, a warm bath, and rest. Tomorrow is soon enough for decisions." Later that night, after Victoria and Emma were settled in the blue room, Wyatt sat at his kitchen table, rolling a glass of whiskey between his palms. He rarely indulged, but tonight his thoughts were troubled. "You're thinking too hard," Mrs. Peterson observed as she dried the last of the supper dishes. "She's got nowhere to go, Martha," Wyatt said, using his housekeeper's first name as he only did in moments of genuine concern. "That baby deserves better than a life on the road. And you're thinking you should offer them a place here." It wasn't a question. Wyatt took a small sip of the whiskey. "Would it be improper? I mean, her husband's barely cold in the ground." Martha Peterson dried her hands and sat across from him. "Offering shelter to a widow and child is never improper. The rest—" She shrugged. "Tom sorts most things out. But Wyatt, be careful with your heart. You've been alone too long, and a woman with a child might seem like an answer to prayers you didn't know you were saying." Wyatt snorted softly. "I'm not some lovesick boy, Martha." "No," she agreed, patting his hand as she rose. "You're a good man. Just make sure whatever you offer, you do it without expectations." The next morning dawned clear and cold. Victoria emerged from the blue room with Emma in her arms, looking somewhat restored after a night of proper rest. Mrs. Peterson had breakfast waiting hotcakes, bacon, and eggs that made Victoria's eyes widen. "I haven't seen this much food at once since we left Philadelphia," she admitted, settling at the table with Emma on her lap. Wyatt entered from outside, bringing the scent of cold air and horses with him. He'd already been out to tend to the morning chores. "How'd you sleep?" he asked, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Better than I have in weeks," Victoria confessed. "Mr. Callahan, I want to thank you again for your hospitality, but I need to figure out what happens next. I have some sewing skills, and I can read and write well. Perhaps there's a town nearby where I might find work." Wyatt poured himself coffee before sitting down. "Nearest real town is Willow Creek, about 20 miles south. It's growing since the stage line added a stop, but jobs for women are scarce, especially with a baby to care for." Victoria's face fell slightly, but she squared her shoulders. "I'll manage. Women do, out of necessity." "There might be another option," Wyatt said carefully. "I could use help around here. Mrs. Peterson does more than her share, and the ranch is growing. I've got 8 hands now, and feeding them is a full-time job itself." Victoria looked surprised. "You're offering me employment?" "Room and board for you and Emma, plus a small wage," Wyatt confirmed. "At least until spring, when travel would be easier if you decide to move on." Mrs. Peterson placed a plate of hotcakes in front of Wyatt with a knowing look he deliberately ignored. Victoria studied him. "That's very generous, but I wouldn't want to impose or create any impropriety. Mrs. Peterson serves as chaperone," Wyatt said. "No one would question your presence here as an employee. But the choice is yours, Mrs. Webb." Victoria looked down at Emma, who was contentedly gumming on her own fist. "Could I have a day to consider it?" "Of course," Wyatt agreed. "In the meantime, I promise to retrieve your trunk. I'll head out after breakfast." True to his word, Wyatt returned that afternoon with Victoria's trunk secured to a pack horse. The simple wooden box contained all that remained of her former life clothing, a few books, her wedding portrait, and James's pocket watch. "Thank you," she said quietly as Wyatt placed the trunk in her room. "For everything. Just being neighborly." He replied with a slight nod before excusing himself. Over the next 3 days, Victoria observed the workings of the ranch. Circle C was modest compared to some spreads, but growing steadily under Wyatt's careful management. The ranch hands lived in a bunkhouse a short distance from the main house, and Mrs. Peterson kept them all well fed and in line with equal vigor. On the 4th morning, Victoria found Wyatt alone at the breakfast table, nursing a cup of coffee while reviewing figures in a ledger. "I'd like to accept your offer," she said without preamble. "But I want to earn my keep, not just be an object of charity." Wyatt closed the ledger. "Never thought otherwise. Mrs. Peterson could use the help with cooking and mending, and come spring, we could use an extra hand with the garden." Victoria nodded. "I know little about ranching, but I'm willing to learn whatever's needed." "Then we have an agreement," Wyatt said, extending his hand. Victoria hesitated only briefly before shaking it, her smaller hand disappearing in his calloused grip. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding, perhaps, or the first tentative thread of connection. As November deepened toward December, Victoria found her place at Circle C. She took over much of the cooking, allowing Mrs. Peterson to focus on the never-ending laundry and mending generated by 9 men and a growing ranch. Emma became the unofficial mascot of Circle C, charming even the most weathered cowboys with her toothless smiles and curious eyes. Wyatt maintained a respectful distance, but Victoria often caught him watching her when he thought she wouldn't notice. Not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but with a kind of quiet wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe she and Emma were real. One evening, after Emma had been put down for the night, Victoria found Wyatt on the porch despite the cold, staring out at the stars. "You'll catch your death," she admonished gently, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she joined him. "Worth it for a view like this," he replied, gesturing upward at the vast canopy of stars. "Sometimes I think God did his best work on the night sky." Victoria followed his gaze upward. "James used to say something similar." She paused, surprised that speaking her late husband's name didn't bring the usual stab of pain. He wanted to build Emma a house with big windows so she could always see the stars. Wyatt nodded. "Sounds like he was a good man." "He was," Victoria confirmed. "Dreamed bigger than his means sometimes, but his heart was true." She hesitated, then added, "He would have liked you, I think." Wyatt turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the darkness. "I'm sorry you lost him." "So am I," Victoria said softly. "But I'm grateful that Emma and I found you, or you found us." The moment stretched between them, delicate and full of unspoken possibilities. Then a particularly cold gust of wind made Victoria shiver, breaking the spell. "We should go in," Wyatt said. "Morning comes early." As they turned to enter the house, their hands brushed accidentally. Neither acknowledged it, but neither pulled away too quickly either. Christmas approached, bringing with it a festive atmosphere despite the isolation. Mrs. Peterson insisted on decorations, and the ranch hands contributed by bringing in a pine tree from the higher elevations to the west. Victoria sewed small ornaments from scraps of fabric, and Emma watched the preparations with wide-eyed fascination. On Christmas Eve, after a special dinner where even the ranch hands were invited to the main house, Wyatt presented Victoria with a small wooden box. "It isn't much," he said gruffly, "but I thought you might like it." Inside was a delicate silver brooch in the shape of a rose. It was simple but beautifully crafted. "Wyatt, it's lovely," Victoria breathed, touching it gently. "But I don't have anything for you." "You and Emma being here is gift enough," he replied, then looked embarrassed at his own sentimentality. "I mean, the cooking's improved considerably since you arrived." Victoria laughed, a sound that had become more frequent as the weeks passed. "In that case, I accept with gratitude." She pinned the brooch to her dress, just above her heart. Mrs. Peterson watched this exchange with a satisfied expression before announcing it was time for hot cider and the telling of Christmas stories. Later that night, after everyone had retired, Victoria stood by Emma's makeshift crib, watching her daughter sleep. The baby had grown so much in just 2 months, already trying to roll over and grab at anything within reach. "Your daddy would be so proud of you," Victoria whispered, "and I think he would be glad we found a safe place to land." A board creaked in the hallway, and Victoria looked up to see Wyatt passing by her open door. He paused, Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. He nodded once, then continued on his way, but Victoria felt warmed by the brief connection. As winter settled fully over the Dakota territory, the ranch fell into a comfortable rhythm. Days were marked by meals, chores, and the care of livestock. Evenings often found the household gathered around the fire, with Mrs. Peterson knitting, Wyatt reading aloud from one of his books, and Victoria mending or playing with Emma. January brought a blizzard that kept everyone confined to the house for 3 days. On the second night, as wind howled around the eaves, Emma developed a worrying cough. By midnight, she was burning with fever, and Victoria was frantic. "Mrs. Peterson, she's getting worse," Victoria said, pacing the kitchen with Emma wailing weakly against her shoulder. "What more can we do?" The older woman frowned as she mixed another honey and whiskey remedy. "Keep her warm and try to get this down her. Sometimes these infant fevers burn themselves out. And sometimes they don't," Victoria said, unable to keep the fear from her voice. She'd seen too many small graves on their journey west. Wyatt appeared in the doorway, his hair rumpled from sleep, but his eyes alert. "What can I do?" "Pray," Mrs. Peterson said simply. Through the night, they took turns walking with Emma, trying to soothe her discomfort. Toward dawn, the baby's fever seemed to break, and she finally fell into a peaceful sleep against Wyatt's broad chest as he sat in the rocking chair by the fire. Victoria, exhausted from worry and lack of sleep, watched them from the doorway. Something in the tableau, the strong rancher cradling the tiny infant with such tenderness, made her heart constrict in a way that was both painful and sweet. "You should get some rest," Wyatt said softly, noticing her. "I've got her." "I know you do," Victoria replied, and they both understood she meant more than just in that moment. By February, Emma had fully recovered and was more active than ever. The first signs of spring were still months away, but the days were gradually lengthening, a promise of the changing season to come. Victoria found herself thinking less about moving on and more about what it would mean to stay. Circle C had become home in a way she hadn't anticipated. Mrs. Peterson was like the mother she'd lost as a girl, and the ranch hands treated her with a protective respect that made her feel valued. And then there was Wyatt. Their friendship had deepened over the winter months, built on shared work, concern for Emma, and long evening conversations. Victoria had learned he'd come west after the war, seeking a fresh start after seeing too much death. He'd worked cattle drives and saved every penny until he could put a down payment on the land that became Circle C. What Victoria couldn't quite define was how her feelings for him were changing. It seemed disloyal to James to acknowledge the flutter in her chest when Wyatt smiled, or the comfort she found in his steady presence. Yet she couldn't deny the attraction growing between them, evidenced in lingering glances and the way they gravitated toward each other in any room. One crisp February afternoon, Victoria bundled Emma up and took her outside to feel the sunshine on her face. They were sitting on a bench near the corral when Wyatt rode in with 2 of his hands, returning from checking fence lines. He dismounted with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life on horseback, handed the reins to one of the men, and walked over to them. His face was windburned, but his smile was warm. "2 of my favorite ladies enjoying the sunshine," he greeted them, tickling Emma under her chin. The baby giggled and reached for him, a reaction that had become common whenever Wyatt was near. "We thought some fresh air would do us good after being cooped up," Victoria explained. "How are the fences?" "Holding mostly. We'll need to do more repairs once the ground thaws." He sat beside them on the bench, leaving a respectful distance. "I've been thinking about spring planting. We could expand the vegetable garden, maybe add some flowers." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Flowers, Mr. Callahan? I wouldn't have taken you for a man concerned with such niceties." "A ranch doesn't have to be just functional," he replied with a slight shrug. "Beauty has its place too." His eyes met hers briefly before looking away. "Besides, every home should have flowers." Home. The word hung between them, weighted with implication. "Yes," Victoria agreed softly. "I think flowers would be lovely." That evening, after Emma was asleep and Mrs. Peterson had retired for the night, Victoria found Wyatt at the kitchen table, laboriously writing in a ledger. "Need any help?" she offered. "I used to keep the books for my father's store back in Philadelphia." Wyatt looked up gratefully. I wouldn't turn it down. Numbers and I have never been the best of friends. She sat beside him, and together they went through the ranch accounts. Their shoulders occasionally brushed as they leaned over the figures, each contact sending a small current through Victoria. Wyatt, she said finally, setting down the pencil. I've been thinking about spring. He tensed slightly beside her. About moving on? No, she said, watching his face carefully. About staying. Permanently. The hope that flared in his eyes made her breath catch. You'd be welcome, he said carefully. You and Emma both. The arrangement we have works well. Victoria gathered her courage. What if I wanted more than an arrangement? Wyatt went very still. Victoria, I would never presume, I know, she interrupted gently. You've been nothing but respectful. Too respectful, sometimes. His eyes widened slightly. Your husband would want Emma and me to be happy. Victoria finished for him. James is gone, Wyatt. I'll always honor his memory, but I'm still here. Still alive. Wyatt reached across the table and took her hand. I never expected to find you out there that day. Never thought I'd feel this way again, or maybe at all. Neither did I, Victoria admitted. But here we are. Here we are, he echoed, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. Victoria, I don't want you to feel obligated. You have a home here regardless. She turned her hand to interlace their fingers. It's not obligation I feel when I look at you, Wyatt Callahan. The kiss, when it finally came, was gentle, a question more than a demand. Victoria answered by leaning closer, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart. When they parted, Wyatt rested his forehead against hers. I should ask this properly. Court you the way you deserve. Victoria smiled. We've been living under the same roof for months. I think we're past formal courtship. Still, he insisted, some things should be done right. And so began a curious sort of courtship between two people who already shared a home, but were discovering each other in new ways. Wyatt brought Victoria wildflowers he found on his rides. She knitted him a scarf in the evenings. They took walks together when weather permitted, Emma bundled between them. The ranch hands noticed the change, but said nothing beyond exchanging knowing glances. Mrs. Peterson was less subtle, making pointed comments about how nice it was to see the house finally feeling like a proper home. By March, the snow was beginning to recede, revealing patches of brown grass and mud. The cattle were thin after the long winter, but healthy overall, promising a good year ahead. Emma was sitting up on her own now, babbling constantly, especially when Wyatt was in the room. On the first truly warm day of the season, Wyatt asked Victoria to ride with him to a ridge overlooking the ranch. Mrs. Peterson was delighted to watch Emma, practically shooing them out the door. They rode side by side. Victoria on a gentle mare Wyatt had trained specifically for her over the winter months. The land was coming alive around them, birds returning, new grass pushing through the soil, buds appearing on the few trees dotting the landscape. At the top of the ridge, they dismounted. Wyatt spread a blanket on a dry patch of ground, and they sat looking out over Circle C. From this vantage point, Victoria could see the full extent of the ranch, the main house and outbuildings, the corrals and barn, the creek that ran along the eastern boundary, and the vast grasslands stretching in all directions. It's beautiful, she said sincerely. You've built something remarkable here, Wyatt. It's still growing, he replied, his gaze taking in the vista. Another few years, and we could double the herd, maybe add some crops on the south section. Victoria noted his use of we, but didn't comment on it. Instead, she leaned against his shoulder, enjoying the simple pleasure of being alone together outside the constraints of the house. Victoria, Wyatt said after a comfortable silence. There's something I need to ask you. She turned to find him looking at her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Yes. When I found you and Emma that day, I was just trying to help two people in need. I never imagined how you would change my life. He took her hands in his. I know it hasn't been that long since James, and if you need more time, I understand. But I can't imagine Circle C without you and Emma anymore. I can't imagine my life without you. Victoria's eyes filled with tears as Wyatt reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. It was my mother's, he explained. Victoria Webb, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Would you help me make Circle C a true home for us and for Emma? Victoria looked at the ring, then at the man holding it, this strong, gentle man who had saved her when she had nothing but a quilt and a baby, who had given them shelter that first night and every night since, who loved her daughter as if she were his own. Yes, she whispered, then more firmly, yes, Wyatt. I would be proud to be your wife. His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger. When he kissed her this time, there was no hesitation, only the promise of the life they would build together. They were married 2 weeks later in the parlor of the main house, with Mrs. Peterson, the ranch hands, and a traveling preacher as witnesses. Emma, dressed in a gown Victoria had sewn from one of her old dresses, was passed among the Callahans during the ceremony, each man awkwardly gentle with their boss's new daughter. That night, after the modest celebration had ended and they were finally alone, Wyatt carried Victoria across the threshold of the bedroom that would now be theirs. Emma slept peacefully in her crib in the adjoining room, undisturbed by the changes happening around her. "Welcome home, Mrs. Callahan," Wyatt murmured against Victoria's hair. "I've been home since the night you found us," she replied, wrapping her arms around his neck. "I just didn't know it yet." As spring blossomed into summer, Circle C flourished under the care of the Callahans. Victoria planted the garden Wyatt had promised, filling it with vegetables and the flowers he'd wanted. The house transformed with small touches, curtains at the windows, a quilt on their bed, toys scattered across the formerly austere parlor. Emma took her first steps in the kitchen, tottering from Mrs. Peterson to Wyatt with a look of determination that made Victoria laugh through happy tears. The baby's first clear word was "Papa," directed unmistakably at Wyatt as he came in from the fields one evening. The big rancher had scooped her up with such joy that Victoria's heart nearly burst with love for them both. By the time autumn painted the landscape in golds and reds, Victoria had news of her own to share. She told Wyatt one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset while Emma played with wooden blocks at their feet. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion when she placed his hand over her still flat stomach. Mrs. Peterson confirmed it. Victoria nodded. "Next spring, Emma will have a little brother or sister." Wyatt gathered her into his arms, mindful of Emma between them. "I never thought I could be this happy," he confessed against her hair. "Neither did I," Victoria admitted. "Especially not that day you found us. I thought my life was over." "Instead, it was just beginning," Wyatt said, pulling back to look at her with eyes full of promise. "For all of us." As the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, Victoria stood at the window of their home, Emma on her hip and Wyatt's child growing beneath her heart. Outside, her husband was bringing in firewood, preparing the ranch for the coming season. The scene was so different from the desperate circumstances of the previous year that it seemed almost like a dream. But the weight of Emma in her arms, the ring on her finger, and the love that filled their home were wonderfully, blessedly real. From nothing but a quilt and a baby, she had found everything she needed: a home, a family, and a love strong enough to weather whatever storms might come.